We're here at the NASDAQ studios in New York with the CEO of Neovasc, Alexei Marko, and you're going to be heading out to the JP Morgan.
Yes.
Yep. And so while we have you, and so I thought we would start out by just for the folks who are not aware of your company at all, when was it founded and when did you become listed on NASDAQ?
Neovasc was founded in 2008, and we listed on NASDAQ in late May of 2014, so coming up on almost a year ago now.
And what's the story behind that? Were you the engineer behind the device, or you?
There's a group of engineers behind it. I was actively involved in the development of our devices, but there's certainly a large team that's working on them, yeah.
And you're working on a catheter-based mitral valve replacement. In other words, you're trying to avoid opening the sternum.
Exactly.
And so what is your route of access? Are you going to the venous side or the arterial side or through the apex of the heart?
We go transapically initially.
Okay.
The device that we developed, it has a transapical access. So we make a small incision of about 1.5 inches to 2 inches long, just between the ribs, and we access the apex through that. We feel that provides a very easy access into the heart, and it has some benefits in terms of being able to operate from essentially very close by. The other access is to come from the groin and come through the femoral artery, but that's a much longer access. It's less invasive, but due to the length of access and the distance away from the heart that you are, it adds some complexity that we believe is handled by the transapical approach.
So the team, is this a pure cardiology team, or is it in an operating room suite because you're entering the lung?
It's a combination. It's a heart team. Typically it's an interventional cardiologist who does the procedure, or we expect that will be at the end of the day, but there's a surgical team there as well to perform the surgical access. So it's a combination of the two.
Okay. And the mitral valve is harder to deal with. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the aortic valve was sort of the low-hanging fruit. It was easier to reach just by the anatomy of the heart. So being on the other side of the heart, the mitral valve has been harder to get to. That's why you're going just straight through the apex.
Exactly. Yes.
What troubles are you able? How's it working out? You've been implanting this in Europe, I suppose.
We've been implanting it in Canada and in Europe. So we've done 4 implants in Canada. We've done our first implant in Europe, and we're about to start implanting in the U.S. in the next few weeks, hopefully. So far, it's been working out very well. We haven't seen any complications or any issues with the implantations. They've gone as we've expected and resulted in complete resolution of the mitral regurgitation and valve disease in these patients. So it's been very exciting thus far.
So would you call these your first-in-man studies?
Yes, this would be an early first-in-man study. We're moving into what we call our Tier 1 study, and that's a formal first-in-man study of 30 patients that will be conducted in the U.S. and elsewhere. Okay,
so we're at the first-in-man stage, not approved even in Europe yet.
Not approved in Europe.
Right. And so now the results of these handful of cases with the aortic valves, we're seeing regurgitation because the valves don't fit well and so forth. What are some of the issues that you're overcoming now?
To be frank, we haven't seen any issues in these first implants. The main issue that we're dealing with right now is patient selection. What we found when implanting our valve is that we completely resolved the mitral regurgitation, which is the leaky valve that we're looking to fix. We haven't seen any leaks around it, and so really the artificial valve that we developed is functioning exactly as we want. What we're trying to determine now is who best to do this to. There's a number of patients who are very old and frail and have this disease, and we believe we can get in there and treat them and do this in a very non-invasive way, in a way that's very well tolerated by these frail patients. The question is there a benefit to these patients? So we're really sort of trying to find which patients benefit most from this, but the device itself is working exactly as we'd hoped.
The disease of this valve, so the aortic valve disease is often calcified stenotic. This is too large of a valve. The valve is given way, the tethering cords. Is that right?
Exactly.
So we're not dealing with a calcified valve.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
So you leave the valve in place and then you expand yours around it. You want to?
Exactly. Yeah. Here's a model that we have. This is actually a patient's heart that has been imaged doing something called a CT scan, and then we printed a 3D model of it and implanted one of our devices in it. You're exactly correct. In the aortic valve, the valve tends to become calcified. It doesn't open properly because it becomes crunchy or hardened. And so that's a different problem than what we see in the mitral valve. A mitral valve tends to fail when the valve itself becomes quite lax and the ventricle, the portion of the heart that it sits in, enlarges, and that causes it not to close properly. So it's really a very different problem that we're trying to solve in a different anatomy.
And the symptoms of mitral regurg, are they as deadly and severe as aortic, or can people live with this? Or?
Yes and no. They're similar symptoms, but as they become increasingly severe, they do result in essentially heart failure, which is extremely debilitating for the patients and will eventually result in death.
And the market potential, are there many more patients with this disease as opposed to aortic, or compared to the aortic valve?
You hear different numbers. I hear anywhere, if you look at the literature and people try to put people into this population into some sort of context, the number is somewhere between 1 times as large and 3 times as large as aortic valve disease. This question comes back to which patients are going to benefit most. So my feeling at the end of the day is the patient population will be about the same size as we're seeing for TAVI, for aortic valve implantations. When you look at the younger patients who might benefit from a traditional surgical approach, you look at the older, frailer patients who may not benefit too much from the repair anyway or the replacement anyway, there's about a third of those patients, I believe, would be suitable for this type of a treatment. So about the same size as TAVI, yes.
This valve, it looks like a nitinol self-expanding.
Yes, it is.
And can you adjust it once you release the parachute, so to speak? Are you stuck, or can you re-manipulate it?
We're resheathable up until a very late stage of deployment, so you can readjust and make sure you have it positioned properly. But once you actually release it into the patient, it's permanent.
Now, the heart's conducting system is not on this. Are you having heart block issues like you do with?
No, we haven't seen any heart block issues, and we did a very significant series of animal trials and everything leading up to this, and we saw no issues in any of the preclinical work, and we've seen no issues in the clinical work.
So the potential problems would be just not fitting, regurgitation, but not the heart block issues.
Right.
What else might you encounter?
One of the big issues with mitral valve implantation is just anchoring properly. It's a valve that has to withstand closure under a very high pressure.
Right.
It sits in a muscular part of the heart that's moving a lot. So really, migration or movement is what we'd be concerned about. And to date, we haven't seen any issues with that, and we believe our design really addresses that.
Is there a hook or something? How do you keep it in place?
Well, there's a number of hooks. You probably can't see on the camera, but there's on the ventricular side, there's 3 anchors that sit up on essentially what's the backbone of the heart. So there's 3 anchors on the bottom that fit onto what we call the fibrous trigones, or what are called the fibrous trigones. So these are areas of the heart that are very robust and fibrous and provide a solid anchor. And then there's another anchoring structures on the ventricular side, and then on the aortic side, there's a flange that sits on the atrial side, there's a flange that just sits on the floor of the atrium and fits that atrium just perfectly. And you'll also notice that it's a D-shaped valve, and the natural shape of the mitral annulus, or the mitral valve, is a D. So we've actually developed our valve to be a D. We believe there's a number of advantages versus a circular valve, which is a little bit of a square peg and round hole type of a situation. So we've matched the native anatomy.
There have been a lot of attempts to deal with mitral valves that are too large, going through the coronary sinus in a roundabout way, or clipping them and so forth. Are you one of the first to actually replace the valve?
We are one of the first to replace the valve, yes.
Okay. And how is the competition? Edwards, Medtronic, are they working on something like this?
Yes, there's a number of folks working on this. Probably the most notable one is Edwards, as you've suggested. They have a program called Fortis, which is roughly at the same stage that we are, doing their very first human implants. They're certainly, we would consider ourselves sort of neck and neck with those guys as far as being the front runners in the space. And then there's a number of other small programs working on it as well. But it's definitely an area of tremendous interest and activity in structural heart disease. Okay,
so the device is called Tiara, correct?
Yes.
And the trials will be called that?
Called Tiara 1 is the first trial we're running. It's the 30-patient feasibility study, and then we'll be running additional trials following that.
With the Tiara trials, are you awaiting some sort of milestone from the FDA where they say you're approved, or is that already happened?
So we have the FDA approval. We had a conditional approval, which we announced in the fall, and we now have a full approval, and we'll begin enrolling in the U.S. shortly.
What's the process there? What's the time frame? What's happening right now? Is it IRB paperwork, or?
Right now it's IRB paperwork. We've actually gotten through the institutional review boards, and now it's down just to the final contracts and the final paperwork. We have.
And your sites will be?
Sites will be Lenox Hill here in New York, Columbia here in New York, and then Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles, and then a number of sites in Europe, specifically Belgium, Germany, and then we have St. Paul's Hospital in Vancouver, Canada.
Okay, great. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Appreciate it.